What if I told you that a US president ate the same cucumber soaked in vinegar every single morning for breakfast? Or that another one had a soda tap installed in the Oval Office, not for guests, just for himself? Or that the most powerful kitchen in the world once served 14-course dinners while a different president in a different decade forgot to eat lunch entirely? Tonight, we are traveling through every presidential administration in American history, from George Washington's hippo ivory dentures to Joe Biden's very devoted relationship with chocolate chip ice cream. 45 presidents, 45 dining rooms, 45 sets of cravings, quirks, and culinary confessions that the history books mostly left out. So, get comfortable, pull the blanket up. Let's begin at 1789 with a man who could barely chew, George Washington and the teeth that weren't his. So, here's the thing about George Washington's relationship with food. By the time he took office in 1789, the man who had commanded armies and crossed the Delaware in the dead of winter had lost nearly all of his natural teeth, the result of years of painful dental problems that followed him from young adulthood straight into the presidency. What replaced them was, to put it charitably, an engineering project. His dentures were constructed from a combination of hippo ivory, metal springs, and human teeth. They were functional, more or less, in the way that a squeaky door hinge is functional. They worked. Nobody was happy about it. The consequence of all this was that Washington's diet became dictated almost entirely by what his mouth could tolerate. Anything requiring real chewing was effectively off the table. His favorites were hoecakes, which are simple cornmeal pancakes, and Washington ate them drowned in butter and honey. He also enjoyed cream of peanut soup and mashed vegetables, foods that required the bare minimum from teeth that were just barely keeping things together. To wash it all down, he reached for Madeira wine, a fortified Portuguese variety that was enormously popular among wealthy colonists of the era. Reportedly, he drank close to a pint a day. Not in one sitting, generally, but still, a pint. Daily. And then there were cherries. When they were in season, Washington ate them by the handful, which feels oddly joyful for a man dealing with chronic dental misery. Perhaps that's the lesson. Life is short, eat the cherries, just maybe go easy on the chewing. John Adams and his morning tankard. Here's the thing about John Adams. He started every single morning of his adult life, including his years as the second president of the United States, with a tankard of hard cider. Not coffee, not tea. Hard cider. Before the sun was fully up, before the correspondence was opened, before any affairs of state were addressed, Adams wrapped his hands around a cold tankard and got on with it. This was not considered especially unusual at the time. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, hard cider was a standard breakfast beverage across New England. Water was often unsafe. Milk spoiled quickly. Cider, lightly fermented and widely available, was simply what people drank in the morning the way we might reach for coffee today. Adams just happened to never stop. Beyond his morning ritual, Adams ate simply and without much drama. New England boiled dinners, salt beef or pork simmered with root vegetables, appeared regularly on his table. Bread with butter, Indian pudding, which is a dense, warm dessert made from cornmeal and molasses. That sounds strange, but was genuinely beloved across the region. His wife Abigail was known to be an excellent cook, and their home life in Massachusetts was reportedly warm, practical, and without pretension. Adams didn't particularly want elaborate meals. He wanted good, honest food and his cider, and to be left in relative peace. He lived to 90 years old, one of the longest-lived presidents in history. When asked about the secret to his longevity, Adams pointed, at least in part, to his lifelong cider habit. Modern doctors might offer a different opinion, but Adams had the last word. as he often preferred to do, simply by outliving most of the argument. Thomas Jefferson and the menu he brought home from Paris. So here's the thing about Thomas Jefferson. He didn't merely eat food. He studied it, cultivated it, imported it, and occasionally changed the course of American culinary history because of it. When Jefferson served as the U.S. Minister to France from 1784 to 1789, he didn't just observe French culture, he absorbed it entirely, and then he brought it home in the form of recipes, equipment, ingredients, and a deeply held conviction that Americans were eating far beneath their potential. He returned with recipes for macaroni and cheese, detailed notes on the preparation of French fries, and instructions for making ice cream, a dessert that was still considered exotic and somewhat theatrical in the United States. He employed a French-trained chef at the White House and made sure the kitchen at Monticello operated at a level that would not have embarrassed a Parisian household. At his Virginia estate, he cultivated 330 varieties of vegetables, not 330 plants, 330 varieties. The man treated his garden the way some people treat a library: organized, obsessive, always expanding. He spent approximately $7,500 on wine during a single year of his presidency, a figure that translates to roughly $200,000 today. This was not considered restrained, even by the standards of his era. Jefferson is often credited with helping to popularize pasta in the United States, having developed a genuine enthusiasm for it during his time abroad. Whether or not he single-handedly introduced macaroni to America, he certainly made it seem sophisticated. And for that at least, generations of comfort food lovers owe him something quiet and appreciative. James Madison and the oyster ice cream situation. Here's the thing about James Madison. He was the smallest president in American history, 5 feet 4 inches tall and approximately 100 pounds, and by most accounts, he ate accordingly. His own meals were modest, unremarkable, and largely undocumented, which is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about a man who seemed to regard food as fuel rather than entertainment. His wife Dolly, however, had an entirely different philosophy. Dolly Madison was one of the most celebrated social figures of the early republic, known for her warmth, her energy, and her instinct for making people feel welcome. She transformed the White House into a genuinely lively place, and she did it largely through the dining room. Her dinner parties were elaborate, abundant, and talked about for weeks afterward. Her signature offering, the thing guests remembered and apparently requested, was oyster ice cream, which is exactly what it sounds like: ice cream flavored with oysters. She served it at the inaugural ball. She served it at state functions. Guests ate it and presumably tried to look as though they had expected this. Dolly also popularized the strawberry ice cream at formal White House events, serving it at the second inaugural in a presentation that was reportedly beautiful and extremely well received. Ice cream in the early 1800s was still a luxury item, and serving it at official events was genuinely impressive. The image this creates, tiny, quiet, James Madison, sitting at one end of a long table, while Dolly orchestrated the room around oyster ice cream, is one of history's more charming domestic imbalances. He ran the country. She ran the dinner party. Arguably, she had the harder job. James Monroe and the first state dinner. So here's the thing about James Monroe. He entered the White House in 1817 with a clear sense of occasion and a willingness to spend money expressing it. He hosted what is considered the first formal state dinner in White House history, complete with French cuisine, fine china, and the kind of careful, deliberate elegance that announced to anyone paying attention that the young American Republic intended to be taken seriously at the table. The French influence on presidential entertaining during this period was significant and not especially subtle. French cuisine was considered the pinnacle of sophisticated cooking. and serving it at official events was a way of signaling cultural ambition, a message that the United States could match European standards of refinement, one dinner course at a time. Monroe was criticized for it. Critics argued that he spent too lavishly on entertaining, that they imported china and elaborate menus were inappropriate extravagances for a democratic republic that was supposed to be above that sort of thing. Soapy. The tension between presidential dignity and public frugality was, it turns out, not a modern invention. Away from the formal dining room, Monroe's personal preferences were considerably simpler. A Virginia breakfast, cured ham, cornbread, and black coffee, was reportedly what he actually wanted most mornings. Not terrapin soup, not pâté. Ham and cornbread and a quiet cup of coffee before the day's correspondence arrived. There is something quietly reassuring about that. The man who hosted the most formal dinner in White House history up to that point just wanted ham and cornbread. The state dinner was for everyone else. The ham was for him. And at 5 a.m, before the world started asking things of him, that distinction probably mattered quite a lot. John Quincy Adams and his swimming habit. Here's the thing about John Quincy Adams. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most disciplined presidents in American history. He woke early, he worked constantly, he kept detailed diaries of his daily life spanning decades, and he approached his own health with the focused intensity of a man who had decided that the body was a project requiring active maintenance. Every morning, Adams rose before the sun and walked approximately 4 miles to the Potomac River, where he removed his clothing and swam naked across the water and back. He did this regardless of the season. He did this as president. He was in his late 50s and 60s during his administration, and he was out there before most of Washington had opened its eyes, swimming in a river. When he returned, he ate fruit and drank a glass of water. That was breakfast, just fruit and water after a 4-mile walk and a swim across the Potomac. On a good day, he might add bread. He wasn't interested in elaborate breakfasts. He was interested in efficiency. He kept meticulous records of everything he consumed, which means historians know more about what Adams ate on a random Tuesday in 1826 than they know about most people's entire dietary histories. He grew mulberry trees on the White House grounds and experimented with raising silkworms, a practical agricultural interest that also resulted in a truly unusual lawn ornament situation for the executive mansion. Adams lived to 80 years old and died, famously, collapsing on the floor of the House of Representatives while still serving as a congressman, long after his presidency. He was working until the very end. He probably would have wanted it that way. Andrew Jackson and the cheese wheel. So here's the thing about Andrew Jackson. He was a frontier soldier and he ate like one. Plain, practical, and entirely without ceremony. Roasted meat, cornbread, and basic provisions were the foundation of his diet throughout most of his life, formed by years of military campaigning in conditions that did not encourage culinary adventurousness. He had a chronically troubled digestive system, partly attributed to years of medical treatments that included swallowing lead shot and other frontier remedies that sound alarming by any modern standard. None of this is the interesting part. The interesting part is the cheese. In 1837, a New York dairy farmer named Thomas Meacham sent Andrew Jackson a gift. A wheel of cheddar cheese weighing approximately 1,400 pounds. It was enormous. It sat in the White House entrance hall for 2 years, aging, filling the corridors with the distinctive presence of a very large cheese. When Jackson prepared to leave office, he decided to share it with the public. He opened the White House to visitors and invited them to come eat the cheese. Approximately 10,000 people arrived. The cheese was consumed in roughly 2 hours. Visitors packed their pockets with it, rubbed it into the carpets, trekked it through the hallways, and generally conducted themselves in the enthusiastic manner of people who had just been offered free cheese by a president. The White House reportedly smelled of cheddar for weeks afterward. Some accounts suggest months. Jackson rode off into retirement. The cheese was gone. The smell for a while was not. It was, by any measure, one of the most democratic things to ever happen inside the executive mansion, and also one of the most fragrant. Martin Van Buren and the gold plate controversy that wasn't. Here's the thing about Martin Van Buren. He had the considerable misfortune of being president during an economic depression and also of having noticeably refined tastes, which, in combination, is not a great look. While Americans across the country were struggling through the Panic of 1837, businesses collapsing, banks failing, unemployment rising, Van Buren was in the White House enjoying strawberries and celery and raisins. These were considered somewhat exotic and expensive ingredients at the time, the kind of thing associated with wealth and cosmopolitan sensibility rather than honest, simple American eating. His political opponents, sensing an opportunity, leaned into the contrast with considerable enthusiasm. Congressman Charles Ogle delivered a speech on the House floor that became famous for its theatrical outrage, claiming that Van Buren dined from gold plates, surrounded by lavish excess, while ordinary citizens suffered. The gold plates were not real. Van Buren did not own gold dinner plates. The speech was political theater and fairly transparent political theater at that. But it worked. The image of a president eating elegantly while the country struggled stuck to Van Buren in a way that proved difficult to shake. The irony is that Van Buren's actual tastes, while refined by frontier standards, were not genuinely extreme. He liked good food prepared well. He preferred strawberries to salt pork. He probably did eat celery without apologizing for it. In another era, this might have been unremarkable. In 1837, during an economic collapse, it was enough to help end his political career. Sometimes the meal doesn't even have to be real to cause damage. The idea of the meal is sufficient. William Henry Harrison and the 31-day presidency. So here's the thing about William Henry Harrison. He holds a record that no one is particularly eager to compete for. The shortest presidency in American history. He was inaugurated on March 4th, 1841, and died on April 4th, 1841. 31 days. So he never really had a chance to establish a dining style. His inaugural menu, the food served at the events surrounding his swearing-in, was notably modest: raw apples, cakes, and lemonade. For the era, this was on the restrained end of inaugural hospitality. It did not hint at the elaborate state dinners that other administrations would stage. Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in presidential history on a cold, wet March day, speaking for nearly 2 hours without a hat or coat. Whether this contributed to his subsequent illness is genuinely debated by historians, though the connection between the cold speech and his death has been popularized into near legend. So, what historians have also noted is that the White House water supply during Harrison's time ran downstream from a public sewer, a sanitation situation that would concern anyone familiar with the basics of waterborne illness. Whether this played a role in his declining health in those final weeks is difficult to confirm with certainty, but it has been raised as a contributing factor. He spent his final days unable to eat solid food at all. The man who had campaigned on frontier vigor, on log cabins and hard cider, reduced to a sickbed in the executive mansion while the country waited anxiously for news. He died 31 days into the job. And with that, the presidency passed, quietly, through constitutional process, to John Tyler, who had been planning to go home to Virginia and had not particularly expected any of this. John Tyler and the 15 children. Here's the thing about John Tyler. He stepped into the presidency without being elected to it, which was a genuinely unprecedented situation in 1841, and which a remarkable number of people in Washington found personally offensive. Congress refused to cooperate with him. His own party expelled him. He was called in the press His Accidency, a nickname that captured the mood fairly efficiently. None of this apparently slowed him down at home. Tyler fathered 15 children, more than any other president in U.S. history. His first wife, Letitia, bore him 8 children before her health declined. He became the first president to marry while in office when he wed Julia Gardner in 1844, who was 30 years his junior and brought considerable energy to White House social life. Julia had enthusiastically European tastes and introduced elements of Italian cooking and the fashionable European dance, the polka, into White House entertaining. State functions under Julia Tyler had a distinctly livelier atmosphere than the contentious political environment surrounding her husband might have suggested. Tyler himself preferred the food of the Virginia countryside where he was raised: fresh oysters, Virginia ham, and pudding. Unpretentious, regional, the kind of cooking that tasted like home and required no explanation or apology. His legacy is complicated. His political career a study in stubbornness and isolation. But at the domestic level, his household was, by most accounts, warm and full and loud in the way that only a house containing many children can be. 15 of them, eventually. However history chooses to evaluate his presidency, the man clearly never lacked for company at the dinner table. James K. Polk and the joyless dinner table. So, here's the thing about James K. Polk. He was, by nearly every historical account, a man who treated the presidency as a full-time occupation and everything else, including meals, as an inconvenient interruption. He worked constantly, slept minimally, and approached his own body's need for food with the resigned tolerance of someone who considered hunger an administrative problem rather than a pleasure to be addressed. He skipped meals regularly. When he did eat, it was simple and quick, coffee being the one consistent presence in his daily routine, the thing he returned to between correspondence and cabinet meeting and the general relentless machinery of governance. Coffee was efficient. Coffee required no table setting. His wife Sarah had her own strong opinions about the White House atmosphere, and she acted on them decisively. She banned hard liquor from official functions entirely. She also prohibited dancing. State dinners under the Polks were reportedly among the most subdued in presidential history. Polite, correct, and by multiple accounts, genuinely difficult to enjoy. Guests arrived dressed for an evening and left, having had a completely orderly experience that somehow felt longer than it actually was. Polk himself probably didn't notice. He was likely already thinking about the next day's agenda. He was one of the most productive presidents in terms of policy goals achieved: territorial expansion, tariff reform, and independent treasury. But he accomplished all of it while apparently running on coffee fumes and determination and very little actual nutrition. He left office after a single term, exhausted and visibly worn. He died just 3 months after his presidency ended in June of 1849. He was 53 years old. Whether the skipped meals contributed to his early decline is speculation, but it seems reasonable to eat lunch even during a presidency. Zachary Taylor and the fatal 4th of July. Here's the thing about Zachary Taylor. He was a military general who had spent decades on the frontier, and his palate reflected it. He genuinely enjoyed the simple, hearty cooking of the Southwest and Mexico, developed during years of military service on the border. Corn, beans, and the kind of food that frontier soldiers actually ate, rather than food designed to impress anyone. As president, he brought that unpretentious appetite to Washington. He was not a man particularly interested in elegant dining. He was interested in food that tasted familiar and filled him up. On July 4th, 1850, Taylor attended a lengthy ceremony at the Washington Monument, still under construction at the time, where he sat in the summer heat for hours, listening to speeches and participating in the celebration. Afterward, he reportedly consumed a large quantity of raw cherries and iced milk, possibly also raw vegetables, depending on the account. Within days, he developed severe gastrointestinal distress. He died on July 9th, 1850, just 5 days later. He had been president for 16 months. The official cause of death was listed as acute gastroenteritis. Whether the food he ate on the 4th actually caused his death, or whether a pre-existing illness was the primary factor, has been debated by historians and medical professionals for decades. His remains were even briefly exhumed in 1991 to test for arsenic poisoning, which was ultimately not found in significant quantities. The cherries and iced milk may or may not have been the culprits, but the combination of summer heat, raw food, and questionable water in the capital did not help. Taylor had survived wars. He did not survive July, Millard Fillmore, and the stove nobody would touch. So here's the thing about Millard Fillmore. He inherited a presidency, a country in tension, and a kitchen that was, technologically speaking, stuck in an earlier century. When he arrived at the White House in 1850, the cooking was still done over an open fireplace, the same general method that had been used since the building's early days. It was slow, it was inconsistent, and it produced results that varied based almost entirely on the skill and intuition of whoever was managing the flames. Fillmore decided this should change. He arranged for the installation of an iron cooking stove, one of the modern cast iron ranges that were becoming increasingly common in well-equipped American kitchens of the era. It was an improvement in nearly every practical sense. More controllable heat, more consistent results, better efficiency. The kitchen staff, however, was unconvinced. Sue, the cook who had been managing the White House kitchen with the open fireplace, looked at the new iron stove and declined to use it. She was not opposed to cooking. She was opposed to this particular machine, which she did not understand and did not trust. It sat there, modern and unused, while she continued doing things the way she had always done them. Fillmore, rather than simply ordering compliance, took a different approach. He visited the U.S. Patent Office located in Washington and studied the technical documentation on the stove's operation until he understood how it worked. He then returned to the kitchen and taught the cook himself, explaining the mechanics, demonstrating the controls, walking her through the process step by step. It is one of the quieter, more patient moments in presidential history. Not a dramatic act, not a memorable speech. Just a president standing in a kitchen, explaining a stove. It worked. The stove was used. Franklin Pierce and the very long goodbye. Here's the thing about Franklin Pierce. The transition from Fillmore's patient kitchen lesson to his administration is a study in contrasts and in how differently men of the same era could carry the weight of high office. Pierce arrived at the White House in 1853, already carrying enormous personal grief. He and his wife, Jane, had watched their 11-year-old son, Benny, die in a train accident just weeks before the inauguration. The presidency began in mourning, and for many historians, it never quite recovered its footing. Pierce struggled deeply during his time in office, and his relationship with food reflected the broader difficulty of his years in Washington. He reportedly ate very little solid food, favoring fried clams among the few things he consistently consumed. He drank heavily, which was known to those around him and commented upon in various accounts from the period. His administration was marked by increasing political turbulence over the question of slavery's expansion. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 deepened national tensions rather than resolving them, and Pierce found himself caught in a crisis that steadily overwhelmed his presidency. He left office in 1857 without his party's renomination, a quiet but clear political verdict. When someone later asked him what a man should do after leaving the presidency, Pierce reportedly replied that there was nothing left to do but get drunk. It's a line that has been quoted many times since, usually with a mixture of sadness and dark amusement. What the comment actually reflects is a man who had lost his son, struggled with his health, and watched his presidency unravel. The food, or the lack of it, was just one small symptom of something much larger. Pierce deserves to be remembered with some compassion alongside the criticism. James Buchanan and the 10-gallon situation. So here's the thing about James Buchanan. Where Pierce's table was sparse and his spirit depleted, Buchanan operated on an entirely different scale, at least when it came to the social functions of the White House. Buchanan was the only president who never married, which meant the hostess duties fell to his niece, Harriet Lane, who was by all accounts charming, capable, and genuinely talented at the social architecture of Washington entertaining. Under their combined management, the Buchanan White House was known for lavish, elaborate dinner parties that spared little expense. The menus were extraordinary by any standard. Terrapin soup, made from turtle, appeared regularly. Imported pâté and fine European wines filled the table alongside roasted meats and rich desserts. Buchanan was known to purchase whiskey by the 10-gallon jug, and his consumption was substantial by the accounts of those who observed his household. He reportedly had the capacity to drink quite a lot without visible effect, which was sometimes noted with a mixture of admiration and concern by his contemporaries. Whether this was a genuine physiological trait or simply practiced habit is difficult to say. The contrast between the elegance of the Buchanan dinner table and the state of the nation during his presidency has been noted by historians with some regularity. The country was drifting toward the most catastrophic internal crisis in its history, and the White House dining room was serving terrapin soup and imported wines. Buchanan was not an indifferent man, but he was a president who struggled to translate concern into effective action during a genuinely terrible moment. He left office in March of 1861. 6 weeks later, the Civil War began. The dinner parties were over. A very different kind of presidency was about to begin. Abraham Lincoln and the Forgotten Lunch. We're 15 presidents into this long, delicious journey through history. If your eyes are getting heavier, that's exactly right. Settle a little deeper into where you are. We've got plenty more to go. Here's the thing about Abraham Lincoln. The contrast between James Buchanan's elaborate table and Lincoln's relationship with food is almost architectural in its sharpness. Lincoln was, in the plainest possible terms, indifferent to eating, not opposed to it, not philosophically against meals, simply unbothered in a way that seemed to baffle the people around him. He would become absorbed in work, in reading, in the endless and devastating correspondence of a wartime presidency, and food would simply fall away from his attention entirely. His wife Mary had to remind him to eat. This was not occasional. It was a recurring feature of their domestic life in the White House. Mary checking in, finding Abraham still at his desk, and redirecting him toward whatever meal had been waiting, probably cooling for some time. When Lincoln did express a food preference, it was modest. He liked apples. He drank black coffee. He had a fondness for a frontier dish called fricasseed chicken, simple preparation of chicken cooked in its own juices that connected back to his Illinois upbringing. At formal state dinners, guests noted that Lincoln barely touched his plate. He sat at the head of the table, engaged in conversation, but the food in front of him often went largely uneaten. Whether this was distraction, discomfort with the formality of Washington entertaining, or simply a natural absence of appetite during an extraordinarily stressful period in his life, is difficult to say with certainty. Probably some combination of all three. A man carrying what Lincoln carried during those years may simply not have had much hunger left over for dinner. Andrew Johnson and the etiquette problem. So here's the thing about Andrew Johnson. He came to the presidency through the most difficult possible circumstances, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in April of 1865, and he arrived in the executive mansion as a man who had built his entire life by the force of his own effort. Johnson was born into poverty in North Carolina and received no formal education. He taught himself to read as a young adult with the help of his wife Eliza and became a tailor before entering politics. He was a genuinely self made man in the fullest sense of that phrase, and he carried the values of that background with him every day. At the table, those values were immediately visible. Johnson's personal food preferences were rooted firmly in the cooking of the Tennessee countryside where he had built his career: corn pone, fried potatoes, and turnip greens. Simple, honest, Southern food. The kind of cooking that required good ingredients and patience rather than a French trained chef. The challenge came at state dinners. The formal dining rituals of the Washington establishment, the careful progression of courses, the specific placement of silverware, the layered etiquette of a 19th century official banquet were not things Johnson had grown up with. By some accounts, he was uncomfortable with the complexity of official table settings and the unspoken social rules that governed how a president was expected to behave at a formal dinner. This discomfort was one small thread in a much larger tension that defined his presidency. A man of working-class origins navigating a capital built on class distinctions and established hierarchies. He was impeached by the House of Representatives in 1868, though he was acquitted by the Senate. He served out his term and went home to Tennessee. Ulysses S. Grant and the burned steak. Here's the thing about Ulysses S. Grant. He liked his steak cooked until it was, by most reasonable definitions, no longer a steak in any enjoyable sense. He wanted it nearly charcoal, dark, completely cooked through, with no trace of pink anywhere near the center. The sight of undercooked meat or any visible blood in food made him genuinely uncomfortable. For a man who had commanded some of the most intense military campaigns in American history, this sensitivity might seem unexpected. But Grant was reportedly quite squeamish when it came to food preparation. He refused to eat poultry as president, reportedly because he had once witnessed a chicken being slaughtered, and the memory stayed with him in a way that permanently altered his appetite for it. His breakfast was one of the more memorable in presidential history. A cucumber soaked in vinegar, accompanied by a cup of black coffee, every morning. The cucumber and vinegar was not a condiment or a side dish. It was the meal. He ate it daily and appeared to find it entirely satisfactory. Grant served 2 terms, from 1869 to 1877, and his administration was both celebrated for its prosecution of Reconstruction and complicated by corruption scandals among members of his cabinet. He himself was known to be personally honest, and those who knew him described a man of genuine warmth beneath the quiet exterior. He died in 1885 from throat cancer, just days after completing his memoirs, a book he wrote specifically to provide for his family after his death, finishing it while gravely ill. Burned steak and vinegar cucumbers, right until the very end. Rutherford B. Hayes and the spiked punch secret. So here's the thing about Rutherford B. Hayes. Ulysses Grant liked his drink strong and his steak stronger. The presidency that followed took a rather different position on the subject of beverages. So, Hayes entered the White House in 1877 with his wife Lucy beside him, and Lucy Hayes had a firm, unwavering opinion about alcohol. There should be none. Not at state dinners, not at diplomatic receptions, not anywhere on the official White House menu. She was the first president's wife to have graduated from college, and she brought to the role a set of convictions that she did not leave at the door. The decision to ban alcohol from all official White House functions was absolute. State dinners, previously occasions for fine wine and diplomatic toasts, were now fruit juice and water affairs. The diplomatic community was not enthusiastic. Foreign ministers and ambassadors, accustomed to a certain standard of White House hospitality, found themselves sitting through long formal dinners with glasses of lemonade while trying to maintain the appropriate expressions. Lucy was nicknamed Lemonade Lucy, not affectionately by everyone. though she reportedly took it in stride. What happened next has been told by staff members of the era and reported by historians. Someone at some point during the Hayes administration began spiking the Roman punch, a frozen dessert served between courses, with rum. The rum was mixed into the sherbet before serving, invisible to the eye and subtle enough that guests might simply think the dessert was unusually pleasant. The Hayes administration denied for many years that this had occurred. Whether Lucy knew is uncertain. Whether the president knew is equally unclear. But the diplomats, by most accounts, seemed to enjoy dessert considerably more than the rest of the meal. James Garfield and the enormous appetite. Here's the thing about James Garfield. There is something almost poignant about his place in this long history of presidential eating habits, because Garfield was a man known for his robust, enthusiastic appetite, yet he spent most of his presidency unable to eat at all. Garfield came to the White House in March of 1881 as a large, physically vigorous man with a genuine love of food. He was known to consume multiple full meals in a single sitting, an impressive capacity that friends and colleagues noted with some admiration. His favorite breakfast was steak with rich gravy, hearty, filling, the kind of meal a man eats when he intends to do a full day's work and means it. In July of 1881, just 4 months into his presidency, Charles Guiteau shot Garfield at a Washington train station. The wound itself was serious but not immediately fatal. What followed, however, was an 80-day ordeal that has since become one of the most studied cases in American medical history. Garfield lingered through the summer, unable to consume solid food. His medical team, attempting to provide nutrition while he recovered, used a method common in medical practice at the time. Rectal feeding, delivering liquid nutrition, including beef broth and whiskey through that route. Doctors also repeatedly probed the wound to locate the bullet, introducing infection in the process. He died on September 19, 1881. Medical historians have noted that the wound itself might have been survivable with modern antiseptic practice. So, the man who had eaten steak and gravy for breakfast 4 months earlier was gone, weighing significantly less than when he had taken office. He had been president for 200 days, Chester Arthur and the 14-course dinner. So here's the thing about Chester Arthur. From James Garfield's forced simplicity, we arrive at a president who approached the dinner table as though it were a formal occasion, requiring the full attention of civilization. Arthur was, without much serious competition, the most extravagant dining president of the 19th century. He brought to the White House a set of standards that would not have seemed excessive in a European royal household, and he applied them with complete conviction. He employed a French chef. He served dinners of 14 courses. He reportedly had the White House china replaced 4 times during his administration, each new set more elaborate than the last. A typical Arthur dinner was not a meal so much as an architectural event. It might begin with turtle soup, move through fish, then mutton, then chicken, pause for a Roman punch to cleanse the palate, continue with canvasback duck, proceed through salad, and arrive eventually at ice cream, fresh fruit, coffee, and a full cheese course. 14 courses. At dinner. On a regular basis. Arthur had become president in September of 1881 following Garfield's death, and he surprised nearly everyone by being a more capable and reform-minded president than his critics had anticipated. He championed civil service reform, which reduced the role of political patronage in government hiring. He was competent, dignified, and took both his office and his dinner table very seriously. He also, before moving into the White House, reportedly had 27 wagons of existing White House furniture removed and auctioned off, replacing it with interiors designed by Louis Comfort Tiffany. The man had opinions about his surroundings. Strong ones. Whether the food or the furniture mattered more to him is genuinely difficult to say, but both were exceptional. Grover Cleveland and the secret surgery at sea. Here's the thing about Grover Cleveland. Chester Arthur's elaborate 14-course productions give way to a man whose appetite was considerably more straightforward and whose most dramatic food-related moment had nothing to do with what he ate. Cleveland was a large man. He weighed over 250 pounds during his presidencies, and he ate with the uncomplicated enthusiasm that his frame suggested. Corned beef and cabbage was a genuine favorite, the kind of hearty, filling dish he returned to without apology. At dinner parties, he was known to consume substantial quantities, and nobody who observed him seemed particularly surprised by this. Cleveland served 2 non-consecutive terms, 1885 to 1889, and then 1893 to 1897, making him both the 22nd and 24th president, the only person in U.S. history to achieve that particular distinction. In 1893, during his second term, Cleveland discovered a rough patch on the roof of his mouth that was diagnosed as a malignant growth. The diagnosis was serious. The timing was terrible. The country was entering a financial panic, and Cleveland made a decision. Nobody would know. He arranged for surgery to be performed aboard a friend's private yacht, the Oneida, as it traveled up the East River in New York. The operation removed a significant portion of his upper jaw. He was fitted with a rubber prosthetic. He recovered. He returned to Washington. The press did not report it. The surgery remained secret for nearly 24 years. A physician who had participated eventually revealed it in 1917, long after Cleveland's death in 1908. Cleveland had protected the information completely, correctly judging that the country's confidence could not absorb the news at that particular moment. Benjamin Harrison and the electric light, nobody would touch. So here's the thing about Benjamin Harrison. Grover Cleveland's quiet management of his own health stands in interesting contrast to the atmosphere inside the White House that Harrison occupied between Cleveland's 2 terms. Harrison served from 1889 to 1893, and his administration brought a genuinely significant technological change to the executive mansion. Electricity. The White House received electric lighting during Harrison's tenure. The wiring installed, the bulbs fitted, the switches placed on walls throughout the building. The kitchen staff would not touch them. This was not stubbornness exactly. It was a completely understandable response to a technology that was new, unfamiliar, and had a reputation, not entirely unearned in its early years, for occasionally behaving in alarming ways. The staff had been told, or had concluded on their own, that touching the light switches might result in electrocution. So they didn't. They left the lights on. The White House reportedly burned its electric lights all night, every night, because nobody was willing to reach up and turn them off. Harrison himself was apparently equally reluctant, and the family sometimes simply went to sleep with the lights blazing rather than engage with the switches. Harrison's personal eating habits were simple and without drama. Roast beef, corn, and the kind of plain American cooking that required no explanation. He was known for being reserved in personality. Servants and staff described him as formal and cool in manner, not unkind, but not particularly warm in the way that some presidents were. He lost his re-election bid to Grover Cleveland in 1892, making Cleveland the returning president of a White House that had recently learned, somewhat reluctantly, that electricity was here to stay. Whether they had started turning the lights off by then is not recorded. William McKinley and the wafer cookies. Here's the thing about William McKinley. Benjamin Harrison's reserved White House gives way in tone and texture to something considerably warmer. McKinley was a president defined less by grand gestures at the table than by one small, specific, deeply personal food tradition. McKinley's favorite food was a thin cookie, a simple wafer made by his wife, Ida. She baked them herself in large quantities, and McKinley carried them with him and offered them to visitors throughout his presidency. Guests who came to the White House, dignitaries, politicians, ordinary citizens, many of them left with one of Ida's wafers pressed into their hand by the president himself. She reportedly made thousands of them over the course of his time in office. Ida McKinley had significant health challenges throughout her life, including epilepsy, and McKinley was, by all historical accounts, a devoted and attentive husband. The cookies she made were a small, tangible expression of that domestic partnership brought into the public life of the presidency in a quiet way. McKinley himself started most mornings with a fried egg and coffee, straightforward, practical, nothing that required much decision making before the day began. He was an affable man, known for his warmth with people, and his approach to food reflected a similar lack of pretension. In September of 1901, McKinley was attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, greeting a long line of visitors in the Temple of Music when he was shot by Leon Czolgosz. He died 8 days later. He had been president since 1897. His successor was Theodore Roosevelt, who was 42 years old at the time, the youngest man ever to assume the presidency. And Roosevelt, as it happens, had very strong opinions about breakfast, Theodore Roosevelt, and the bathtub cup of coffee. So here's the thing about Theodore Roosevelt. The transition from McKinley's quiet warmth and simple fried eggs is a bit like stepping from a calm reading room directly into a gymnasium. Roosevelt was 42 when he became president in September of 1901, and he brought to the White House a level of physical energy and personal intensity that had not previously been seen in the executive mansion and has arguably not been matched since. He boxed, he hiked, he wrestled, he went on expeditions. He did all of this while also running the country, writing books, and apparently consuming extraordinary quantities of coffee. Roosevelt's coffee consumption during his presidency was, by most accounts, remarkable. His son described his cup as being more like a bathtub than a teacup, large, full, and thoroughly meant. He drank it throughout the day, the way most people might drink water. It was essentially a constant. He reportedly ate 12 eggs for breakfast on a regular basis, not 12 eggs as an occasional indulgence, 12 eggs as a reasonable morning meal. He was also enthusiastic about game meats, bear steaks, elk, buffalo, the foods of the frontier and the hunting camp that aligned with the outdoor, vigorous identity he had cultivated since childhood. He refused to eat chicken, reportedly having declared it food for the weak. This is an extraordinary position for any person to hold about chicken, but Roosevelt wasn't known for half measures. The Maxwell House coffee brand adopted the slogan, "Good to the last drop," after Roosevelt allegedly praised a cup at the Maxwell House Hotel in Nashville. Whether the story is precisely as told, the association stuck, and it remains on the label to this day. Roosevelt had opinions, and people remembered them. We are 30 presidents deep into this warm, wandering history of what America's leaders ate, drank, and occasionally refused to touch. If you're still awake, your eyelids are probably getting heavier with every sentence. Good. That means the history is working. Pull the blanket up a little. We've still got a long, comfortable way to go. William Howard Taft and the breakfast steak. Here's the thing about William Howard Taft. If Theodore Roosevelt was the presidency at full volume, Taft was something altogether different. A man of enormous personal warmth, considerable legal brilliance, and an appetite that matched his substantial frame in every direction. Taft was the heaviest president in American history, weighing approximately 340 pounds during his time in office. He ate accordingly. A 12-ounce steak for breakfast was not unusual. Sure, a typical Taft dinner might include turtle soup, salmon, roast beef, a full salad course, dessert, and a cheese course to finish. The kind of meal that required both a good appetite and a generous amount of time. The story about the White House bathtub is perhaps the most famous Taft anecdote. The claim that he became stuck in the standard tub and required assistance from multiple staff members to be freed. Historians note that while a larger bathtub was indeed installed in the White House during his administration, The getting stuck story is likely embellished or entirely apocryphal. The tub itself, however, was real, large enough to accommodate 4 average-sized men by contemporary accounts. Taft had become president somewhat reluctantly, pushed into the role in part by Theodore Roosevelt's enthusiastic endorsement. So, his real ambition was always the law. After losing the presidency in 1912, coming in third behind both Woodrow Wilson and Roosevelt, he eventually achieved his true goal, becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1921. After leaving the presidency, he lost approximately 80 pounds. The discipline he applied to the law, it turned out, could also be applied to breakfast. He served as Chief Justice until shortly before his death in 1930. He considered it the best job he ever had. Woodrow Wilson and the raw egg breakfast. So here's the thing about Woodrow Wilson. From Taft's generous table and considerable appetite, we move into a presidency defined by habit, routine, and a breakfast that most people would require significant convincing to attempt even once. Wilson ate the same lunch almost every day. Raw eggs beaten into grape juice. Not cooked eggs. Not scrambled, not fried. Not prepared in any of the ways that make eggs palatable to most of the human population. Raw, beaten, mixed into grape juice, and consumed as a meal. He found this satisfying. He returned to it daily. One can only respect the commitment, if not the enthusiasm. Wilson was a creature of deep routine in all areas of life. He disliked surprises at the dinner table the way some people dislike surprises in general, with a particular personal intensity that went beyond ordinary preference. He wanted to know what was coming, in food as in most things. He served as president from 1913 to 1921, guiding the country through the World War I and attempting to negotiate a lasting peace settlement at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. The Versailles Treaty and the proposed League of Nations became the great consuming effort of his later presidency. In October of 1919, Wilson suffered a severe stroke that left him partially paralyzed. His recovery was long and incomplete, and during that period, his wife Edith became the primary gatekeeper of access to the president, managing his correspondence, controlling who could see him, and making decisions about what information and requests reached him. She also managed his diet during this period, determining what he ate and when. It was one of the most significant examples of a First Lady's behind-the-scenes influence in presidential history. Wilson remained in office until March of 1921. Warren G. Harding and the Poker Night provisions. Here's the thing about Warren G. Harding. Woodrow Wilson's disciplined routines and strict table habits give way in the next administration to an atmosphere that was considerably more relaxed and considerably more festive, despite the law of the land. Harding became president in March of 1921 during Prohibition, the constitutional ban on the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages that had taken effect in January of 1920. Prohibition was the law. Harding was the president. These two facts coexisted in a state of creative tension inside the White House. Choice. Harding hosted regular poker nights with a circle of friends and colleagues, known informally as the Poker Cabinet, a group that gathered for cards, conversation, and bootleg whiskey provided by the President of the United States. While the country was officially dry, the White House poker room was not. Harding served illegal alcohol to his guests with a cheerful disregard for the amendment he had taken an oath to uphold. His personal food preferences were more modest than this entertainment style might suggest. He enjoyed waffles with chipped beef, a straightforward filling dish, and knockwurst, a German-style sausage that he had developed a taste for and returned to regularly. Harding died suddenly in San Francisco in August of 1923 while on a cross-country tour. The cause of death was reported as a heart attack, and his passing was sudden enough to generate considerable speculation in the years that followed. though no evidence of anything other than natural causes was ever established. He was succeeded by Calvin Coolidge, who was vice president and happened to be visiting his father in Vermont when the news arrived. A setting that could not have been more different from the White House poker nights he was about to inherit. Calvin Coolidge and the petroleum jelly breakfast. So here's the thing about Calvin Coolidge. The jump from Harding's warm, convivial poker evenings is, tonally speaking, a significant gear change. Coolidge was a man of very few words, famously so. Stories about his silences are almost as numerous as his documented statements, and both sets are smaller than you might expect from a two-term president. He was from Vermont, so he was dry in manner, and he was private in ways that kept historians perpetually working. His most singular domestic habit, however, is well documented. Coolidge liked to eat breakfast in bed while having his head rubbed with petroleum jelly. Not on separate occasions, simultaneously. The breakfast arrived, the petroleum jelly arrived, and Coolidge sat there eating while a staff member applied the jelly to his scalp. He apparently found this arrangement comfortable and reasonable, and nobody around him seems to have felt they were in a position to disagree. His food preferences otherwise tended toward the familiar and the regional. Vermont cheddar cheese, corn muffins, and the simple New England cooking of his upbringing. He was not interested in elaborate dinners or culinary adventure. He kept a pet raccoon named Rebecca, originally sent to the White House to be served as a Thanksgiving meal, which Coolidge declined to do. Rebecca became a household pet instead, wore a collar, was walked on a leash, and by some accounts occasionally joined the family at meals. Whether this was charming or complicated probably depended on where you were sitting at the table. Coolidge chose not to seek re-election in 1928, issuing his announcement in characteristically brief terms. He retired to Northampton, Massachusetts, where he lived quietly until his death in 1933. Brief, private, and with petroleum jelly. That was Calvin Coolidge. Herbert Hoover and the formal dinner for two. Here's the thing about Herbert Hoover. Calvin Coolidge's quiet Vermont sensibility leads us to a president who maintained a very different kind of formality, one that became, in the context of the era he occupied, a genuine liability. Hoover and his wife Lou were known for maintaining a precise, elegant household standard throughout his presidency, which lasted from 1929 to 1933. Every evening, regardless of whether guests were present, the Hoovers dressed formally for dinner. Suits and gowns, white table linens, multiple courses served by staff. The full arrangement every night, even when it was just the two of them. There is nothing inherently wrong with this. People maintain the standards they were raised with, or the ones they've built for themselves over time. Hoover had risen from genuine poverty, orphaned young, raised by relatives, self-made through education and engineering. And the formality of his household reflected the life he had built, rather than the one he'd started with. The problem was timing. The stock market crashed in October of 1929, months into Hoover's presidency, and the Great Depression settled over the country with devastating force. By 1932, millions of Americans were out of work. Many were going hungry, and images of Hoovervilles, the makeshift camps where displaced families lived, appeared in newspapers across the country. Against that backdrop, the image of the president dressing formally for a private dinner served by household staff became a symbol that critics used to devastating effect, regardless of Hoover's genuine efforts to address the crisis. He donated his presidential salary to charity throughout his time in office, a fact that received considerably less attention than the dinner jacket. History, like dinner, is often a question of presentation. Franklin D. Roosevelt and the housekeeper who wouldn't budge. So, here's the thing about Franklin D. Roosevelt. Herbert Hoover's formal dinners for two give way to a White House that was, in culinary terms, about to take a significant step backward, despite the arrival of one of the most dynamic presidencies in American history. Roosevelt entered the White House in March of 1933 with enormous political energy, a sweeping legislative agenda, and a housekeeper named Henrietta Nesbit, who was about to make everyone who sat down to eat deeply, quietly miserable. Nesbit was hired by Eleanor Roosevelt specifically because she was economical, a reasonable priority during the Depression. She was loyal, hardworking, and completely committed to a cooking philosophy that prioritized frugality over flavor. The results were meals that White House staff, guests, and the president himself found consistently underwhelming. Vegetables were overcooked until they surrendered entirely. Dishes arrived bland, gray, and without particular enthusiasm. Visiting dignitaries accustomed to the hospitality of other world capitals, choice reportedly braced themselves before White House meals. Winston Churchill, who visited multiple times during World War II, brought his own brandy, a diplomatic solution to a culinary problem. Roosevelt complained. He complained regularly, by multiple accounts, about the food in his own house. Eleanor, for reasons that were partly practical and partly philosophical, she genuinely did not consider elaborate food a priority, declined to replace Nesbit. The meals continued. The president continued to eat them. Nesbit served throughout the entire Roosevelt administration, from 1933 to 1945. 12 years of overcooked vegetables in the most famous dining room in America. Roosevelt managed the New Deal, guided the country through the Second World War, won 4 presidential elections, and never successfully negotiated a better dinner. Some battles, apparently, are simply not winnable. Harry Truman and the shot of bourbon at dawn. Here's the thing about Harry Truman. From Roosevelt's famously grim White House meals, we arrive at a president who had no patience for pretension and every intention of eating exactly the way he wanted to. Truman was from Independence, Missouri, and he carried that straightforward Midwestern identity with him into the presidency with complete consistency. He did not arrive at the White House planning to become a different person. He arrived planning to do the job and go home to the food he had always liked. His morning routine was specific and unwavering. He rose early, took a brisk walk of 1 to 2 miles around Washington, and before or after that walk, started the day with a shot of bourbon and a glass of orange juice. This was not considered a drinking problem. It was considered a Missouri morning, and Truman maintained it throughout his presidency without apparent concern for what anyone thought about it. His preferred meals were rooted in the cooking he had grown up with: fried chicken, roast beef, mashed potatoes, and the kind of honest, filling food that required no culinary translation. He ate lunch at his desk, usually a sandwich, because there was work to do, and the dining room felt like a long way to go for a midday meal. The formality of White House dining was something Truman actively pushed against. He found the elaborate rituals of official entertaining uncomfortable and worked throughout his tenure to simplify meals and reduce unnecessary ceremony. He wanted dinner to feel like dinner, not a diplomatic performance. He served until January of 1953, having overseen the end of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War, and the Korean conflict. He returned to independence, where the food was exactly as he remembered it, and that, by all accounts, suited him perfectly. Dwight Eisenhower and the rooftop grill. So here's the thing about Dwight Eisenhower. Harry Truman's simple desk lunches and Missouri cooking give way to something unexpectedly charming. A 5-star general who liked nothing better than to stand over a grill and cook dinner himself. Eisenhower was one of the very few presidents who genuinely enjoyed cooking as a personal activity rather than something that happened to him in a formal dining room. He had a personal recipe for vegetable beef soup that he prepared for guests himself, adjusting the ingredients with the attention of someone who cared about the outcome. He grilled steaks on the roof of the White House, a detail that feels almost impossible to picture and yet is well documented. His beef stew recipe was treated by those who received it as a genuine gift. He shared it, wrote it out, and took evident pride in it. Eisenhower in an apron, managing a pot of stew, is not the image most people carry of the supreme Allied commander of World War II, but it was apparently a regular domestic reality. In September of 1955, Eisenhower suffered a heart attack while on vacation in Colorado. He was 64 years old. His doctors placed him on a strict cardiac diet, reduced fats, controlled portions, careful management of what he consumed. Eisenhower followed this diet with approximately the same compliance he had applied to military regulations that inconvenienced him, which is to say, selectively. He continued grilling steaks. He continued making his soup. He won re-election in 1956 by a large margin and served until January of 1961. He lived until March of 1969, reaching age 78. The steak probably didn't help, but the man had already survived the Second World War. A grilled ribeye felt manageable by comparison. John F. Kennedy and the 10-minute state dinner. Here's the thing about John F. Kennedy. Eisenhower's relaxed rooftop grilling gives way to a White House that suddenly, in January of 1961, became concerned with elegance in a way it hadn't been for some time. Jacqueline Kennedy wasted very little time in transforming the White House dining experience. One of her early decisions was to hire René Verdun, a classically trained French chef, making him the first formally trained French chef to serve in the White House kitchen. State dinners under the Kennedy administration became celebrated events, carefully designed, beautifully presented, and talked about in Washington and abroad as genuine cultural occasions rather than obligatory official meals. The contrast between the formal grandeur of Kennedy-era state dinners and what the president himself actually preferred to eat is one of the quieter ironies of his administration. Kennedy's personal favorites were New England clam chowder, the thick, creamy Boston variety he had grown up with, and grilled cheese sandwiches. Straightforward, undemanding, entirely without pretension. The man who presided over glamorous diplomatic dinners apparently wanted soup and toast when left to his own preferences. He had Addison's disease, a condition affecting the adrenal glands, and chronic back pain that had followed him since his naval service in World War II. Both conditions affected his energy and his appetite in ways that those close to him noticed. He reportedly ate his meals very quickly, finishing in under 10 minutes, which guests at official functions occasionally observed with some surprise. Whether this was habit, discomfort, or simply a preference for getting meals over with so he could return to the work waiting on his desk is not entirely clear. Probably some combination. The soup was good, the cheese was good, and there was always more to do. Lyndon B. Johnson and the Fresca tap. So, here's the thing about Lyndon B. Johnson. The refined elegance of Kennedy's White House dining gives way, in November of 1963, to something considerably more Texas in character. Johnson brought to the presidency a directness, a scale, and a set of personal preferences that were entirely his own, and which he made no effort to moderate for Washington sensibilities. He was from the Texas Hill Country, and that was where his appetite lived. His most famous food obsession was Pedernales River chili, a recipe from his Texas ranch that he ate in substantial quantities and insisted on serving at official events, to the mild bewilderment of visiting diplomats who had arrived expecting something more conventionally formal. Johnson gave the recipe out freely, and it was published and distributed widely during his presidency. But perhaps the most memorable detail of the Johnson White House food story is the Fresca tap. Fresca was a grapefruit-flavored diet soda introduced by Coca-Cola in 1966. Johnson developed an intense fondness for it, the kind of fondness that goes well beyond simply keeping it in the refrigerator. He had a special dispenser installed in the Oval Office so that Fresca was available on demand at any moment, without requiring anyone to fetch a bottle. It was a soda tap in the Oval Office, for one man's diet grapefruit drink. He also grilled steaks at his Texas ranch while conducting policy discussions, sometimes handing tongs to visiting foreign officials who had not anticipated participating in the cooking portion of the diplomatic meeting. Whether this was a deliberate loosening of formality or simply how Johnson operated, the result was the same. Guests left, having both discussed policy and managed a grill. Johnson declined to seek re-election in 1968 and returned to Texas, where the chili was waiting. Richard Nixon and the cottage cheese situation. Here's the thing about Richard Nixon. From Johnson's Fresca Tap and open-air Texas grilling, we arrive at a president whose comfort food choices generated a quiet, persistent curiosity among those who observed them. Nixon ate cottage cheese with ketchup on top. This was his known comfort food, the thing he reached for when the choice was entirely his own. Cottage cheese, which is mild and unremarkable on its own, combined with ketchup, which is sweet and tangy and designed for entirely different purposes. So, Nixon combined them without apparent self-consciousness and ate the result with every sign of satisfaction. He also requested ketchup on a wide variety of other foods, to the barely concealed dismay of the White House kitchen staff. The chef reportedly considered the ketchup habit a personal affront to the craft of cooking. Nixon was unbothered. His preferred dinner was meatloaf, another plainly American choice, the kind of food that requires no ceremony and makes no claims to sophistication. Comfortable, familiar, entirely practical. The detail that has attached itself most firmly to Nixon's food history is this. On the evening before he announced his resignation from the presidency in August of 1974, the meal he ate was meatloaf. Whether this was deliberate comfort-seeking on one of the most difficult nights of his life, or simply the standing order for that particular evening, is not entirely clear. But the image of it has stayed in the historical record. The last dinner of a presidency, a plate of meatloaf in the family quarters, before the speech that would end his time in office. He resigned the following day, August 9th, 1974, and Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th President of the United States before the afternoon was over. Gerald Ford and the English muffin every morning. So here's the thing about Gerald Ford. Richard Nixon's meatloaf gives way, in the span of a single August afternoon, to a president whose breakfast was perhaps the most consistent in White House history. Ford started every morning with an English muffin, toasted with butter, accompanied by a glass of orange juice. Every morning, without variation, without the kind of restless experimentation that some presidents brought to their daily routines. The English muffin was what it was, and Ford was satisfied with that. He ate the same lunch as well, with similar consistency. Cottage cheese and a sliced peach. Those who noticed the parallel between Ford's cottage cheese lunch and Nixon's cottage cheese with ketchup comfort food chose, mostly, not to comment publicly on it. The difference, presumably, was the absence of ketchup and the presence of fruit. Ford's wife, Betty, made efforts to introduce more variety and adventurousness to the White House table. She had broader culinary interests and a willingness to try things that extended beyond the English muffin and the cottage cheese situation. Ford was politely resistant. He knew what he liked. Change in this particular area was not something he was pursuing. He had come to the presidency without being elected to either the vice presidency or the presidency. Appointed vice president after Spiro Agnew's resignation, then elevated to president when Nixon resigned. He was a decent, steady man who had served in Congress for 25 years and brought a straightforward Midwestern reliability to a White House that had just been through an extraordinarily turbulent period. He lost the 1976 presidential election to Jimmy Carter by a narrow margin. He returned to private life and lived until December of 2006, reaching age 93. The English muffins presumably continued without interruption. We are 40 presidents into this long, warm, wandering history of what the most powerful people in America actually put on their plates. If you are still reading along, your eyes are probably doing that slow, comfortable thing where the words are starting to blur very gently at the edges. That's exactly right. That means the history is working. Settle in. We're almost there. Jimmy Carter and the grits on the table. Here's the thing about Jimmy Carter. Gerald Ford's reliable English muffin gives way to a president who brought something the White House hadn't seen in quite some time: Southern home cooking, genuine agricultural credibility, and a deep personal connection to the food on his table. Carter arrived at the White House in January of 1977 as a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, and he did not pretend to be anything else. His food preferences were rooted entirely in the cooking of the rural South: grits, catfish, cornbread, and the kind of breakfast that a Georgia farmer eats before going out to tend to things that require actual physical attention. He took an active interest in the White House menu in a way that few presidents had, personally reviewing what was being served and keeping the meals modest, in keeping with his broader message of restraint during a period of economic strain and the energy crisis that defined much of his domestic agenda. Serving simple food was, for Carter, a statement about values as much as a matter of personal preference. The peanut connection was naturally impossible to overlook. Reporters mentioned it, cartoonists drew it. Carter embraced it without defensiveness. He was a peanut farmer. He liked peanuts. This was not complicated. He also involved himself in the practical details of White House management more directly than most presidents, which extended to the kitchen. The result was a dining room that felt, by most accounts, more genuinely American and less performatively formal than some previous administrations had managed. Carter served one term, losing the 1980 election to Ronald Reagan. He went home to Plains, Georgia, where he continued building houses with Habitat for Humanity and growing peanuts, living with a quiet consistency that matched, in its own way, the food he had always preferred: Ronald Reagan and the jelly bean presidency. So here's the thing about Ronald Reagan. Jimmy Carter's straightforward Southern table gives way to a president who brought to the White House a snack food that became, over 8 years, one of the most recognizable symbols of an entire administration. Reagan loved jelly beans. Specifically, he loved Jelly Belly brand jelly beans, the small, intensely flavored variety that had been introduced in the late 1970s and which Reagan had reportedly discovered while trying to give up pipe smoking during his time as governor of California. The jelly beans became a replacement habit, and he carried the habit all the way to the Oval Office. A jar of jelly beans sat on the desk in the Oval Office throughout his presidency. He offered them to cabinet members, to visiting officials, to journalists, to anyone who sat across from him in that room. It became a ritual of the Reagan White House. Arrive for a meeting, receive jelly beans, proceed with the agenda. Over the course of his 2 terms, approximately 3.5 tons of Jelly Belly jelly beans were shipped to the White House. Blueberry-flavored jelly beans were specially produced so that red, white, and blue combinations could be prepared for the 1981 inauguration. Beyond the jelly beans, Reagan's other great food comfort was macaroni and cheese, which he ate with evident happiness and zero apology. Nancy Reagan, meanwhile, preferred the refined French cooking of the White House chef, and state dinners during the Reagan years were genuinely elegant affairs that bore little resemblance to the jar of candy on the president's desk. Reagan lived until June of 2004, reaching age 93. The jelly beans outlasted almost everything else about the administration in the public memory, which seems appropriate somehow. George H.W. Bush and the broccoli ban. Here's the thing about George Herbert Walker Bush. He did not like broccoli. This is on its own an unremarkable personal preference, shared by a significant portion of the population at any given time. What made it presidential was what he did with it. Bush banned broccoli from the White House and from Air Force One. He informed the press of this decision directly, stating plainly that he was the President of the United States and would not be eating any more broccoli. He had not liked it as a child. He had eaten it anyway because his mother told him to. He was now president, and the broccoli era of his life was finished. The response from the American broccoli industry was swift and theatrical. Broccoli farmers organized a protest, sending truckloads of the vegetable to the White House, several tons of broccoli arriving at the gates in a convoy that generated significant press coverage and visible amusement from everyone except, presumably, the man inside who had started the whole thing. Bush declined to change his position. The broccoli was donated to food banks. His actual favorite food was pork rinds, the fried pork skin snack that is about as far from a White House formal dining image as it's possible to get. When this became public knowledge, pork rind sales in the United States reportedly increased by 11%. The presidential endorsement, even an accidental one, carries weight. Bush served one term, losing the 1992 election to Bill Clinton. He lived until November of 2018, reaching age 94. The broccoli ban was never officially lifted during his lifetime. Bill Clinton and the morning jog to McDonald's. So here's the thing about Bill Clinton. George H.W. Bush's broccoli ban gives way to a president whose relationship with food was, by his own eventual admission, something he had to reckon with seriously before it caught up with him entirely. Clinton arrived at the White House in January of 1993 with an appetite that had been well documented during his years as governor of Arkansas. He liked barbecue. He liked donuts. He liked chicken enchiladas and the kind of generous, Southern-inflected cooking that does not concern itself with portion size as a primary value. His morning jogs through Washington became a familiar sight during his early presidency. The president in running gear, making his way through the streets with his security detail. What made them memorable was the destination. The runs occasionally ended at McDonald's, where Clinton would stop for breakfast before heading back to the White House. The image of a jogging president pausing at a fast food counter became something reporters noted with a mixture of amusement and genuine affection. He served 2 full terms, leaving office in January of 2001. In 2004, Clinton underwent quadruple bypass surgery, a significant cardiac procedure that required the careful, sustained attention of his medical team and a serious reassessment of how he had been living. The transformation that followed was one of the more dramatic dietary shifts in the post-presidential record. Clinton adopted a plant-based diet. No meat, no dairy, an approach rooted in the kind of whole food nutrition his doctors recommended for his heart's long-term health. He spoke publicly about the change multiple times, crediting it with his improved health and energy. From morning jogs to McDonald's to a plant-based diet, it is in its own way one of the more complete personal journeys in this entire story. George W. Bush and the peanut butter sandwich. Here's the thing about George W. Bush. Bill Clinton's dramatic dietary transformation gives way to a president whose lunchtime habits were, by contrast, almost aggressively straightforward. Bush ate the same lunch almost every day during his presidency. A peanut butter and honey sandwich on white bread. Not a variation on the theme. The same sandwich, reliably, day after day. It was simple, it was quick, and it suited a man who had other things on his mind and did not need lunch to be complicated. Bush was notably disciplined about physical fitness throughout his presidency. He ran regularly, later transitioning to cycling when his knees required it, and he maintained a rigorous workout schedule that those around him described as a genuine personal priority rather than a political image concern. He requested low-fat meals at official functions and kept close attention to what he ate in the context of his broader fitness routine. The exception was Tex-Mex. Bush had a genuine and well-documented enthusiasm for the food of his home state, specifically cheeseburgers prepared in the Tex-Mex tradition, which occupied a comfortable exception to the otherwise controlled dietary approach. He had stopped drinking alcohol in 1986 at age 40, a personal decision he maintained without exception throughout his presidency and afterward. He spoke about this publicly on various occasions, and it was a consistent, unchanging fact of his daily life in the White House. His presidency spanned 2 terms, from 2001 to 2009, covering September 11, 2001, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and Hurricane Katrina. Throughout all of it, somewhere in the middle of most days, there was a peanut butter and honey sandwich on white bread waiting on his desk. Some constants are comforting precisely because they don't change. Barack Obama and the 7 almonds. So here's the thing about Barack Obama. His nightly snack became one of the more quietly fascinating food details of any modern administration. Obama ate exactly 7 almonds as his nightly snack. Not 6, not 8, 7. This specific number was reported by his personal chef and staff, and confirmed in various accounts of daily life in the Obama White House. His team found it, by general consensus, both admirably disciplined and mildly amusing. 7 almonds is a number that suggests either careful nutritional planning or a very particular relationship with the concept of moderation. Obama's broader food preferences were well documented. His favorite meal was a medium well burger with yellow mustard, not ketchup. Show, which generated a brief but genuine media discussion in 2009 when he ordered it at a Washington restaurant, and the mustard choice was deemed notable enough to report. He clearly had opinions about condiments, which puts him in distinguished presidential company. Michelle Obama's Let's Move initiative, launched in 2010, was a significant public health campaign focused on childhood nutrition and physical activity, one of the most visible domestic policy efforts of her time as First Lady. The program brought national attention to school lunch nutrition standards and encouraged healthier eating habits across the country. Meanwhile, the president was quietly ordering cheeseburgers, not as a contradiction of the campaign. He was not its spokesperson, but as the ordinary food behavior of a man who liked what he liked, while also genuinely believing in the broader message. He served 2 full terms, leaving office in January of 2017. The 7 almond detail has stayed in circulation ever since, which suggests that people find the precision of it oddly relatable. We all have our specific number of something. Donald Trump and the fast food banquet. Here's the thing about Donald Trump. His food preferences became, almost immediately upon taking office in January of 2017, a subject of significant national conversation. Trump was known throughout his first term for his consistent preference for fast food. McDonald's, Wendy's, and Kentucky Fried Chicken appeared in documented accounts of his regular meals. He reportedly preferred fast food in part because of the standardization it offered. The same product, made the same way, at locations across the country, with a consistency that a kitchen producing something fresh could not guarantee in the same way. He ate his steak well done with ketchup on the side, a combination that generated considerable comment from people who had opinions about steak preparation, which turned out to be a surprisingly large portion of the American public. The moment that most firmly attached his food preferences to the historical record came in January of 2019, when Clemson University's football team visited the White House to celebrate their national championship. So, the meal Trump arranged for them was a spread of fast food, McDonald's, Wendy's, Domino's Pizza, and Burger King, displayed on silver serving platters in the state dining room. He stood behind the table with visible pride, gesturing toward the assembled burgers and boxes. Some players loved it. The images circulated globally. Opinions varied widely. Trump won re-election in 2024 and began his second term in January of 2025. By all accounts, his food preferences traveled with him back to the White House unchanged. The well-done steak was waiting. The fast food was on standby. Some things in presidential history remain entirely consistent. Joe Biden and the ice cream presidency. So here's the thing about Joe Biden. Donald Trump's fast food banquets give way in January of 2021 to a president who brought to the White House an enthusiasm for one particular food that quickly became one of the most recognizable details of his public image. Biden liked ice cream. Not casually, not occasionally, genuinely, consistently, and with a visible happiness that cameras captured on many occasions throughout his presidency. His preferences ran to chocolate chip varieties, with Jenny's Splendid ice creams and Baskin-Robbins both appearing in documented accounts of his regular choices. He was photographed eating ice cream often enough that it became a reliable visual shorthand in media coverage. The president, cone in hand, outside an ice cream shop, looking satisfied in a way that suggested the ice cream was genuinely the best part of that particular moment. The images accumulated over his term into something that felt less like a political image and more like an authentic personal detail, which is perhaps why they resonated. Beyond the ice cream, Biden's food preferences included pasta with red sauce and a chicken parmesan sandwich from a shop near his home in Wilmington, Delaware. The kind of local spot a person returns to because they know exactly what they're going to get, and it has never once disappointed them. He had represented Delaware in the U.S. Senate for 36 years before becoming vice president under Obama, and then winning the presidency in 2020. He announced in July of 2024 that he would not seek re-election, endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris to carry the Democratic ticket forward. He left office in January of 2025, having served one term. The ice cream shops of Delaware were, presumably, glad to have him back as a regular customer. We are 50 chapters into this long, comfortable journey through presidential kitchens, dining rooms, and the occasional fast food parking lot. If you have made it this far and your eyes are still open, they are doing so out of pure determination. Let them close. The history will keep. You have earned the rest. The White House kitchen. Through the ages, Joe Biden's ice cream cones lead us naturally away from the presidents themselves and into the remarkable institution that fed them. A kitchen that has operated continuously through wars and elections and seismic national events, producing meals for the people who ran the country. The modern White House kitchen is a professional operation capable of preparing a formal dinner for 140 guests. It is staffed by 5 full-time chefs, supported by additional personnel during large events, and operates with the kind of logistical precision that a restaurant of that scale requires. The equipment is current, the pantry is well stocked, and the menus are planned well in advance. What most people don't know is that the president pays for his own food. The cost of the first family's personal meals comes from the president's salary, not from public funds. Taxpayers cover the operational costs of the White House, but the groceries for the family's daily eating are a personal expense. State dinners and official functions are a separate budgetary matter, but the president's breakfast, lunch, and dinner come out of his own pocket, just like anyone else's. This has been the arrangement throughout most of presidential history, and it creates an interesting, quiet reality. The most famous kitchen in America, stocked and staffed by one of the world's most powerful institutions, cooking meals that the person eating them is personally paying for. Some presidents found the arrangement perfectly natural. Others, particularly those who came from modest backgrounds, found the formality of having staff prepare their personal meals something to adjust to. Truman never quite got comfortable with it. Lincoln barely noticed, mostly because he forgot to eat. The kitchen kept cooking, regardless. The most lavish state dinner in history. The everyday presidential kitchen is one thing, but the White House state dinner is something else entirely. An occasion designed to communicate, through food and setting and choreography, something about the country hosting it. State dinners are diplomatic instruments as much as they are meals. The guest list, the menu, the table settings, the entertainment, All of it sends signals that foreign guests receive and interpret carefully. A well executed state dinner conveys confidence, cultural sophistication, and a certain kind of national pride expressed through hospitality. By many accounts, the most extraordinary state dinner in White House history was not actually held at the White House at all. In July of 1961, President John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy hosted Pakistani President Ayub Khan at George Washington's historic estate, Mount Vernon, in Virginia. 138 guests were transported down the Potomac River by boat to the estate, where they dined on a French-inspired menu served on the lawn, under a summer evening sky, with the National Symphony Orchestra performing nearby. The setting, the Founding Fathers' home, the river, the summer evening, was theatrical in the best possible sense. Jackie Kennedy, who had a genuine gift for the architecture of such occasions, had orchestrated an experience that guests described in glowing terms for years afterward. It was not merely a dinner, it was a statement, carefully composed and beautifully delivered. The meal itself featured French cuisine. Jacqueline Kennedy's consistent preference for state dining served with the precision that her chef, René Verdun, brought to every official occasion. Guests arrived by boat and left with a specific feeling of having attended something genuinely memorable. In the long history of presidential entertaining, the Mount Vernon dinner stands as one of its finest hours. The first White House beer from the grandeur of Kennedy's Mount Vernon dinner, we come to something considerably more approachable. A story about honey, a garden, and a Freedom of Information Act request. Barack Obama became the first president to brew beer inside the White House. The operation began in 2011 when the White House kitchen started producing two varieties of home-brewed ale, a honey ale and a honey porter. The honey used in both recipes came from Michelle Obama's White House garden, a kitchen garden she had established in 2009 on the South Lawn, the first significant vegetable garden on the White House grounds since Eleanor Roosevelt's wartime garden during World War II. The brewing was done by the White House kitchen staff, and the beer was served at official events and informal gatherings. Obama brought bottles of it to campaign stops and shared it with voters, which generated both goodwill and curiosity about the recipes. The curiosity became, in the way of the modern information age, a formal petition. Members of the public submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for the White House beer recipes, a legal mechanism typically used to obtain government documents, here deployed in the service of home brewing enthusiasm. The Obama administration released the recipes. They were published publicly and quickly picked up by home brewers across the country. Trey, who reproduced the White House honey ale and honey porter in kitchens and garages from coast to coast. It is one of the more cheerful outcomes of government transparency legislation ever recorded. Federal disclosure law applied to a beer recipe, resulting in thousands of home brewers making presidential ale in their own kitchens. The honey was from the garden. The garden was Michelle's. The beer, in a meaningful sense, belonged to everyone. What the Secret Service knows about your dinner. The beer recipe was public. What happens to the president's food before it reaches the table is considerably less so. Food security for the President of the United States is a subject the Secret Service does not discuss in detail by design. What is known comes from former White House staff, journalists, and the occasional memoir. Accounts that together paint a picture of a system designed to eliminate risk at every point between ingredient and plate. The White House kitchen operates with strict access controls. Staff who work in the kitchen undergo thorough background checks. Food suppliers are vetted. Ingredients for significant official meals are sourced through channels that allow for tracking and verification. The kitchen itself, during major events, is a controlled environment. Whether a dedicated food taster is employed, the role that has existed in royal courts and powerful households for centuries, is something the Secret Service has neither confirmed nor denied in any official statement. Former staff members have described precautions, including pre-screened ingredients and sealed preparation areas, chow, but the specific protocols remain appropriately undisclosed. What this means in practice is that every meal the president eats at an official function, and many meals eaten privately, have passed through a system designed to ensure they are exactly what they appear to be. The chef prepares the food, the kitchen is secured, the plate travels from preparation to table through a chain of custody that most restaurant diners never have to think about. For the president, this is simply Tuesday, or any other day. The food arrives, it has been through its process, and the most powerful person in the country sits down to eat the same dinner everyone else is having, just with considerably more paperwork behind it. The Thanksgiving turkey that got a pardon from the careful security of the presidential kitchen. We move to one of the most warmly anticipated annual traditions in the White House calendar, one that involves a very fortunate bird and a surprisingly recent origin story. The tradition of the President of the United States formally pardoning a Thanksgiving turkey is one of those customs that feels as though it must stretch back to the earliest days of the Republic. It has the comfortable weight of something ancient, something that George Washington or Abraham Lincoln surely must have started in a moment of autumnal goodwill. The actual history is considerably more recent than most people assume. The formal, official tradition of the presidential turkey pardon began with George Herbert Walker Bush in 1989. On November 13th of that year, Bush stood before assembled press and cameras and officially pardoned a turkey presented to him by the National Turkey Federation, sending it to a farm rather than to a kitchen. The moment was lighthearted, the press enjoyed it, and a tradition was established with the straightforward logic of things that simply work. Before Bush formalized it, there had been occasional informal moments of presidential turkey clemency. John F. Kennedy sent a turkey home without eating it in 1963, reportedly remarking that it looked good enough to let live. Truman received turkeys from the National Turkey Federation beginning in 1947, but the presentation was a photo opportunity rather than a formal pardon. Those birds were generally eaten. The story that Abraham Lincoln started the tradition stems from a well-documented episode in which his son Tad became attached to a Christmas turkey named Jack and persuaded his father to spare it. But this was a Christmas turkey, not a Thanksgiving one, and it was a single-family moment rather than an established presidential ritual. The pardoned turkey today travels to a farm in Virginia, where it lives out its days in comfortable obscurity, occasionally visited by people who think the whole thing is genuinely charming. The farm has changed over the years, and the logistics of turkey retirement have been refined with each passing administration. Some turkeys have gone to Disneyland, some have gone to university farms. All of them have gone somewhere considerably better than the alternative. Bush started it in 1989. The turkey has been safe ever since. Eleanor's garden and Michelle's garden. The turkey pardon is a tradition rooted in generosity and a light touch of ceremony. The White House vegetable garden has a different energy entirely, practical, purposeful, and on both occasions it has been planted, quietly controversial in ways that say something interesting about how Americans relate to the idea of a first lady with an agenda. Eleanor Roosevelt planted the first significant vegetable garden on the White House grounds in 1943. The United States was deep into World War II. Resources were being directed toward the war effort, and the federal government was actively encouraging American families to grow their own food in what were called victory gardens, home plots that reduced the demand on commercial food supplies and allowed more to be directed toward military use. Eleanor's garden was both a practical contribution and a public statement of solidarity with the millions of American families doing the same thing in their own backyards. It was not universally welcomed. The Department of Agriculture initially expressed concern that a White House vegetable garden might send the wrong signal about the adequacy of the commercial food supply. Eleanor planted it anyway. The garden produced vegetables. The vegetables were eaten. The message was received. 66 years later, in 2009, Michelle Obama broke ground on the second significant White House kitchen garden, also on the South Lawn. The garden was part of her broader Let's Move initiative focused on childhood nutrition and healthy eating, and it was designed to be both productive and educational. School children were invited to help plant and harvest, connecting the experience of growing food to the larger conversation about what Americans were eating. The response, again, included criticism. Some commentators argued the garden was a political statement about food choices, an implication that Americans were not making the right ones. The parallel to the reaction Eleanor's garden had received decades earlier was not lost on observers who knew the history. Both gardens grew food. Both first ladies used them as platforms for something larger than lettuce. Both were criticized for it and proceeded regardless. The South Lawn, it turns out, has always been a place where the personal and the political grow side by side, whether anyone planned it that way or not. What they eat at 30,000 feet. The White House kitchen feeds the president at home. But the presidency is not a stationary job, and the question of what a president eats when the country, or the world, requires them to be somewhere else is a logistical challenge that has been solved with considerable thoroughness by the United States Air Force. Air Force One, the modified Boeing VC-25A aircraft that serves as the primary presidential transport, carries 2 full galleys capable of producing meals for up to 100 people simultaneously. This is not a warming kitchen with reheated trays. It is a functioning food preparation operation at 30,000 feet, staffed by Air Force personnel trained in both cooking and the specific requirements of presidential travel. The food loaded onto Air Force One before each flight is prepared at a military base and brought aboard prior to departure. The sourcing and handling of ingredients follows protocols consistent with the broader food security measures applied to everything the president eats. Menus are planned in advance and customized for each trip based on the length of the flight, the time of day, the number of passengers, and the specific preferences of the president and any notable guests traveling with the administration. This means that Air Force One has, over the decades, produced an extraordinary variety of meals at altitude. Reagan's jelly beans traveled with him naturally. Nixon's meatloaf was presumably reproducible at cruising altitude. Johnson, one imagines, found a way to have his chili regardless of the flight path. The galley adapts to whoever is in the forward cabin. Long international flights require full meals, multiple courses, appropriate beverages, and the kind of sustained hospitality that keeps a traveling delegation functional across time zones. Shorter domestic legs might mean something closer to a working lunch. Sandwiches, salads, coffee, whatever gets the day moving. The crew rotates, the menus change, the aircraft lands in a different city or a different country, and the kitchen begins preparing for the return journey. Somewhere above the clouds, American history has been fed, one flight at a time, by people whose names never appear in the history books, but whose work kept everything running. The Camp David kitchen Air Force One handles the president in the air. For quieter moments closer to home, there is a retreat in the Maryland mountains that has served as a presidential sanctuary for decades, and whose kitchen tells its own quiet story about what presidents eat when they finally relax. Camp David sits in the Catoctin Mountains of Maryland, approximately 60 miles from Washington. It has been used as a presidential retreat since Franklin Roosevelt, who called it Shangri-La. Dwight Eisenhower renamed it Camp David in 1953, after his grandson. It has been there ever since, a wooded, secure, deliberately low-key alternative to the formality of the White House, a place where presidents can think, rest, host foreign leaders in a relaxed setting, and eat food that doesn't require a seating chart. The Camp David kitchen operates separately from the White House kitchen, staffed by Navy personnel, and the meals produced there tend to reflect the more informal atmosphere of the retreat. Presidents request comfort food at Camp David in a way they might not always feel free to do in the executive mansion. The setting encourages a certain ease that the White House, with all its ceremony, doesn't always provide. Eisenhower grilled steaks at Camp David. It suited both his personality and the wooded, unpretentious setting of the retreat perfectly. A general at a grill, feeding guests without ceremony. Reagan hosted barbecues there, relaxed affairs that matched the warm, accessible public image he cultivated throughout his presidency. The mountain air, the informality, the absence of Washington's watching eyes. Camp David consistently brought out the more comfortable, personal side of presidential eating habits. Obama ordered pizza delivery to Camp David, which required Secret Service inspection before it could be brought onto the premises. The image of a pizza delivery driver pulling up to a secured presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains, delivery bag in hand, is one of those details that manages to be simultaneously completely ordinary and entirely specific to the American presidency. The pizza was inspected, it was approved, it arrived, presumably still warm. Camp David has hosted peace negotiations, family holidays, and quiet Sunday mornings. The kitchen has fed them all. Food, longevity, and the Jelly Bean exception Camp David and Air Force One speak to the logistics of feeding a president. But there is a larger question sitting quietly beneath all of these chapters, one that the accumulated evidence of presidential eating habits raises without quite being able to answer cleanly. Did what they eat affect how long they lived? The correlation, when you look at it, is genuinely striking in places. John Adams, who drank hard cider every morning and ate simple New England food his entire life, lived to 90. Thomas Jefferson, the wine-drinking, vegetable-growing food enthusiast of Monticello, lived to 83. Herbert Hoover, whose formal dining habits were impeccable, if politically unfortunate, lived to 90, the longest-lived president in history at the time of his death in 1964. John Adams held the longevity record among early presidents for generations. On the other end, William Henry Harrison died after 31 days in office, though his cause of death was illness rather than diet. Zachary Taylor died after 16 months with the July 4th cherries and iced milk playing an at least debated role. Warren Harding died at 57. James Polk died at 53. These were men whose diets ranged from problematic to simply sparse. William Howard Taft, who ate 12-ounce steaks for breakfast and weighed 340 pounds during his presidency, lived to 72. Not the shortest presidential lifespan, though not the longest either. He did lose 80 pounds after leaving office, which his doctors likely found encouraging. And then there is Ronald Reagan. Reagan ate jelly beans throughout his presidency, 3.5 tons of them over 8 years, along with macaroni and cheese and the general comfort food of a man who had found what he liked and was not interested in nutritional optimization. He lived to 93, the longest-lived president in American history, a record he held until George H.W. Bush reached the same age, and then, in 2018, surpassed it at 94. Bush, for the record, hated broccoli and loved pork rinds. He also lived to 94. The correlation between diet and longevity, it turns out, is real in some cases and cheerfully ignored by the universe in others. The jelly beans had the last word. The White House mess and the best perk nobody talks about. Presidential longevity, jelly beans, and the quiet mysteries of what food does to the body over time. All of that gives way now to something a little more everyday, a little more human, and arguably one of the best kept secrets in Washington. The White House mess is a cafeteria. It operates in the basement of the West Wing, run by the United States Navy, and it serves the senior staff who work in the building every single day. Not the president, the staff. The people who write the memos, prepare the briefings, coordinate the schedules, and keep the administrative machinery of the executive branch running from 7 in the morning until the work is done. The menu changes daily. It features the kind of food that, A well run institutional kitchen produces when it genuinely cares about the people it's feeding. Burgers, salads, soup, sandwiches, daily specials that reflect the season and the preferences of the regular customers. It is not a fancy restaurant. It does not try to be. It is a good cafeteria, well managed, reliably satisfying, and priced below what the equivalent food would cost at a restaurant anywhere else in Washington. Access to the White House mess is considered one of the genuine perks of working in the West Wing. It is tiered by seniority. The most senior staff have dining room access, while others order from a takeout window. But the food is the same kitchen, the same quality, the same Navy cooks who have been feeding the staff of multiple administrations with consistent professionalism. There is something quietly wonderful about the image of it. Outside, the work of the American government proceeds at its full weight. Decisions, debates, crises, phone calls, and the endless complex machinery of a nation being governed. Downstairs, someone is having a bowl of soup and a sandwich, eating lunch at a small table before heading back upstairs to do it all again. The most powerful address in the country has a cafeteria in the basement. The Navy runs it, the soup is good, and for the people who work there, it is, on many difficult days, exactly what they needed. And there you have it. The full, strange, surprisingly moving history of what U.S. presidents actually ate. From Washington's butter-soaked hoecakes, eaten through hippo ivory teeth, to Roosevelt's bathtub-sized coffee cup and 12 daily eggs, to Nixon quietly eating meatloaf on the last night of his presidency, to Reagan living to 93 on a diet held together substantially by jelly beans. So tonight, be thankful you don't have to eat raw eggs beaten into grape juice for lunch every single day, that no one is rubbing petroleum jelly on your head while you eat breakfast, that your dinner guests aren't smuggling rum into the dessert course behind your back, and that if you want a midnight snack, you are free, completely and gloriously free, to eat more than exactly 7 almonds. The White House kitchen has fed heroes, complicated men, and everything in between. Sleep well. You've earned it. If presidential food history sounds like your kind of bedtime company, subscribe so you never miss an episode.